Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about a famous book, The Plague by Albert Camus. So let's start. The book is divided into 5 parts. Part 1, the story is developed in the 1940s at Oran, a French town. Dr. Rayo found a dead rat on the landing. Days later, rats in the city started to die in a badly way. He was worried about these events, but because of the trip, which his wife needed to do to a sanitarium to be treated, at first he didn't pay attention to it. The rats stopped dying, probably because there are no more rats to be killed, but unfortunately people started to get ill. So panic increased among people. They not only get ill, but also dead. It was a terrible situation similar to what we are living nowadays. At that moment, it was evident that the plague that surrounded the town was the bubonic plague or Black Death, which affected the Middle Ages, but people just refused to admit it something like that. People continued dying, and doctor asked the authorities to take action to avoid contagion, so the authorities put the town under quarantine. Part 2, people started to feel alone and isolated because some of them were far away from their lovers or families. And of course, at that time, they were not allowed to communicate with their families outside through letters because the plague could spread on them. Only they could send brief telegrams, brief because you can only express your ideas through 10 words. Remember, a journalist, for example, wanted to escape from Noren to go to Paris, where was the woman he loved, but it was impossible. The emergency increased, commerce was affected, hospitals were full, and schools were also used for sick people. A Dr. Hugh Franz Tarot decided to recruit volunteers who work with the plague victims, and Dr. Castle, the Dr. Hugh's old colleague, began working on the anti-plague serum.
In part 3, people continue feeling badly because the plague had destroyed everything, becoming all around a disaster. The plague began striking the wealthier districts just as much as the poorer ones. Some people decided to set fire to their houses, trying to destroy the plague, and the government created heavy prison sentences for arson. There was more violence in the town, and houses that had been burned or quarantined were looted. The only rule that people followed was the curfew, bearing in mind that by 11 the streets were totally empty. The death toll rose and coffins began to dwindle, so the government was forced to bury victims in mass graves. When there was no more space in cemeteries, the authorities had to start cremating the bodies, and due to the continual death and dehumanization, people sank into depression, forgetting their absent loved ones. The plague finished with memories of happiness and hope for the future, and everyone seemed to be exhausted and unhappy. In this part, Dr. Ryu and his partners realized how tired they were because of their constant work against the plague. Cotard was the only person who seemed to be happy at that time because he had always lived in a state of fear, and during the plague, the whole town was in the same state, craving human contact and distrusting at everyone as possible plague carriers. On the other hand, Dr. Castle finished his anti-plague serum, and he decided to give the first injection to Jakes, who was a small child. However, the experiment failed. Jakes suffered terribly before dying. The fever increased, and he finally died while the doctors watched in horror. Since the epidemic had worsened, the public has turned from religion to superstition and vague prophecies. So the church was empty. The food supplies of Oran also began to dwindle, and the division between rich and poor grew because the rich bought extra supplies and the rest were hungry. However, time passed and the plague became easier to control since the situation progressed and the patients were calmer and more receptive.
Part 5. The plague seemed to be over. Dr. Castle's serum became more effective and more cases of recovery appeared. Changes in the population were slow, but simultaneously the optimism increased and Tarot still continued making some notes in his diary. On the other hand, Cottard was the only person who was angry because of the end of the plague. He was afraid of being arrested. Moreover, in this part of the story, Tarot was affected by the plague. Dr. Castle and his mother decided to take care of him at home. Unfortunately, Tarot died after several long days of suffering. After that, the next morning, Dr. Rie was informed about the death of his wife. Then, in February, finally Oran doors were opened. Many people that were still returned to the town, but some of them didn't find anyone waiting for them. Nevertheless, there were celebrations on the streets, and Reed talked about how probably Tarot had no peace during his life. Additionally, Dr. Reed analyzed how people faced the plague in Oran. Then, a few days later, Cotter was arrested after the shooting that he provoked. On the other hand, Dr. Reed visited an asthma patient and agreed with him that people didn't change because of the plague. For that reason, he decided to share his testimony about the plague through this story, expressing what had to be done and the experiences of the people who struggled with the plague. Author Albert Camus was a representative author of non-metropolitan French literature. He was a novelist, essayist, playwright, philosopher, and journalist born in Argelia. His childhood and most of his youth took place there. He lived in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Argel. Thanks to a scholarship that he received because he was a victim of the war, he started his studies. His experiences there, especially in the 30s, hold great influences in his thoughts and different works. His semi-proletarian parents early connected him to intellectual social circles of strongly revolutionary inclinations. Moreover, he had a deep interest in philosophy. When he had 25 years old during the Second World War, he went to France and joined to the resistance movement. Also, he wrote for the newspaper Combat. Another important fact in the life of Albert Camus was the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Literature for his important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. He was 44 years old when he won that award, so that award made him the second youngest person ever to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. On the other hand, Albert Camus wrote The Plague after the Second World War. Through this novel, he posed assorted questions related to nature and human condition destiny, considering that he included metaphors to involve ethical, political, and internal dilemmas. Also, the courage that certain humans hold to face difficult situations as the ones exposed in the story. Relevant works: The Myth of Sisyphus, The Stranger, The Plague, The Fall, And on the other hand, two of Albert Camus' works were published after his death: A Happy Death and The First Man.
Stylistic characteristics. The genre of this book is a philosophical novel. This novel is narrated in first person, faking a third person. This narrator attempts to present his story as factual and objective, like a journalistic account of events rather than a human story. He relates the entire tale in the third person and reveals only in the last chapter that actually here's our main character, Dr. Rio. Although he wants to give an objective account, subjectivity and individuality of experience come through. Camus' writing style. Camus' writing style is concise and specific. He doesn't use excessive amounts of figurative language, but instead boldly expresses his character's view. The brilliance of Camus' writing is his ability to adapt his style to reflect the unique personality of the narrator and the specific themes of each novel, with a focus on showing his character's detachment. This skill becomes apparent after reading his three works: The Plague, The Fall, and The Stranger. Metaphors: Plague and Death. The plague is personified throughout the book as a terrible opponent, stronger than humans or even the forces of heaven. Its scale is attested to in the metaphors of the whole town being in a fever, and the town being a huge and alien laser house. Sunset settles on the town like a red winding sheet. Oran becomes a huge necropolis, or city of the dead. It seems like a lost island of the damned. The buildings are huge inner cubes in lifeless squares, presenting the face of a defunct city. Animals. The plague first comes from animals, and they are the first victims. Thousands of dead rats in the streets are the first portents of the disease. The rats have been in sewers and hidden, but they are the symbol of the corruption in the town that is becoming sick. And for this I quote, "It was as if the earth on which our houses stood were being purged of its secreted humors, thrusting up to the surface the abscesses and the pus clouds that had been forming in its entrails." Also, several characters are compared to animals or obsessed with animals. The old man who abuses cats by spitting on them from the roof soon has no diversion as the cats disappear in the plague. Tahoe observes in his diary a strange family in his hotel where the father looks like a well-brought-up owl, while his wife is a black mouse, and the boy and girl are dressed like performing puddles. Life. Rio uses this metaphor to describe the tenuousness of life for one stricken by the plague. And for this I quote, "Yes, in conclusion, the patient's life hung on a thread, and 3 people out of 4 were too impatient not to make the very slight movement that snapped the thread. The image is one of a person barely hanging on. A thread is an insubstantial, weak thing, and it will not hold anyone alive for very long, if at all. The afflicted person, because they are only human, can hardly resist moving and breaking the thread, thus demonstrating how terribly fatal this disease is." Incarceration. The gates are closed to the people of Oran, and they are now enclosed in by walls and the sky above. The narrator writes of their realization of their failures. But now they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration under that blue dome of sky. The metaphor of imprisonment is a potent one, for it shows just how small, restrictive, and oppressive life is now. Similes. Town. In an early simile, the narrator depicts the town and the startling disruption of plague. And for this I quote, "You must picture the consternation of our little town. Hitherto so tranquil and now out of the blue, shaken to its core like a quite healthy man who all of a sudden feels his temperature shoot up and the blood seething like wildfire in his veins." The simile is very effective not only because it uses the imaginary of health and sickness, relevant to the plague itself, but also because it is an image that allows the reader to see just how scary and disconcerting the swift passage from normal to abnormal, from healthy to sick, actually is. The past. The narrator explains the strangeness of time during the plague, suggesting that people have the irrational longing to hark back to the past, or else to speed up the march of time and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire. With this simile, he indicates that people stuck in a hellish present end up wishing they were back in some past in which plague did not exist, but these ruminations are exquisitely painful because of the sharp contrast with the present moment.
Fear and depression are the most common feelings during a quarantine. These feelings can make people behave in different ways and react subjectively. People can easily do nothing and stay at home because of that fear and deep depression. But during a pandemic situation, there will be always people like Dr. Bernard. His actions and personality imply that he believes in a personal as well as social code of ethics. Although he is separated from his wife, he doesn't allow this personal distress to distract him from his battle to relieve the collective social suffering and the confused and terrified population of Iran. And there is Jantaru. For him, human existence gains meaning only when people choose freely to participate in the losing but noble struggle against death and suffering. Taru contributes to the anti-plague effort in accordance with his code of ethics. He and Dr. Reed care about other people and try to make them feel better with their altruistic actions. There is also people like Father Panelu, the Jesuit priest who early during the epidemic, he delivers a sermon to this confused and frightened congregation, declaring that the plague is a God-sent punishment for their sins and get a position of power in Iran. As the plague rages on, he modifies this stance, seeing the plague as a supreme test of faith. Or there is also people like Kotar, the one who committed a crime before, so he constantly fears arrest and punishment. And when Iran falls under total quarantine, he's happy because he no longer feels alone in his state of constant fear. Moreover, the plague occupies the authorities entirely, so he doesn't fear arrest. He engages in the profitable smuggling trade during the epidemic and eschews all responsibility to help fight disease. To sum up, how people behave during the quarantine depends only on the way they use their time. They can fall into deep depression and possible suicide, or take advantage of that time in a positive or negative way.